We're in the middle of the 8th chapter of Kohelet, and we've been discussing the interaction between the Chacham, the wise person, and the person of power. Okay, and this has been kind of an ongoing discussion. And as he is wont to do, he begins with a thought and gets kind of stuck in that thought for a little bit. He fleshes out a thought fully before moving on from it. And the thought that he got into was the reason why it's better to be wise than to be powerful is because the wise person understands the limit of power that human beings, that your average humans who exert power, the limit that they have over other people, in their power over other people. And he has basically determined that there's two major threats to power. The number one is the limit of time. It's the fact that there's always a clock running on the powerful. And the second thing is that there's a limit to their jurisdiction. And so once he brought up this idea of time, the limit of time on power, he's gotten, I'm sorry, I have a little thing in my throat there. Once he started discussing the limit of time on power, he's now been fleshing it out for quite a bit now, okay, for the past couple of verses. So what we actually saw last week is that there's he discussed a very interesting case of where power shows up, or where the limits of power show up, specifically when there's the way he looks at it is he says, let's look at somebody who loses their power. Let's say a leader, a powerful leader, disappears, right? Either dies, falls apart, whatever. There's, for some reason or another, there's a power vacuum that's created. So when you have that power vacuum, what happens then? It says that's when people start coming out of the woodwork. That's when all these sorts of people come from all over the place. He actually doesn't ever name them by name. He just says they come. Bo'u, they come. Vavo, actually, and they come and they go, and they all claim certain things. They all claim to be good for whatever reason. Maybe they actually are good. Maybe they actually have intentions to be good people. And they come, as he puts it, they come from the Holy Land. Not literally, the Holy Land isn't the land of Israel necessarily, but the Holy Land meaning that they come from a place, a position of holiness. There's a reason why you should choose me, because I will provide you with the things that you need. We refer to that in some ways as holiness. And it says those people, very quickly, they move away from that. Once they actually gain power, they no longer become these big supporters of holiness. They end up leaving that behind and take up some other role, okay? And so that brought us to verse number 11. So let's get into our screen over here. Okay, and sorry. Here we have verse number 11 over here. All righty. So, a second here. All right. Now, we did see it last week, but I want to review it because we didn't have that much time. Okay. So we'll discuss it again, and we'll get a little deeper into it. Verse number 11 says like this. Asher, because, or due to the fact that, Ein na'asa pitgam maseh hara'ah mehira, since the matter where the decree regarding bad actions does not happen quickly, al kain, for that reason, malay leiv b'nei ha'adam, the hearts of mankind are filled, bahem, inside of them, la'asot ra, to do the wicked. Okay? Now, again, as we said last week, this first part, half of the verse, has to be kind of read together. It's one of those Hebrew syntax things. So, Asher ein na'asa pitgam maseh hara'ah mehira, because the matter, or because the decree regarding bad actions is not done quickly, al kain, for that reason, malay leiv b'nei hadam b'hem la'asot ra, it fills the hearts of mankind within them to do evil. As we said last week, if you wanted to, this verse right here could be a standalone lesson for life, right? Why is it? What is it? This is almost a theory on life. Why do people do bad things? You know, we always ask ourselves why good things happen to bad people, why bad things happen to good people. probably perhaps a bigger question that we should ask is, why do people do bad things? That's obviously a question that faces a lot of people, and we do talk about a lot. So why is it that people do bad things? So he gives us a bit of a reason. He says one of the reasons, perhaps the reason, the main reason, the umbrella reason why people do bad things is because we do not see the consequences of our actions immediately. Okay, so there's that point over here, meheira, does not happen quickly, right? As opposed to what you'd think from cartoons as a kid or something like that. When you do something wrong, a lightning bolt doesn't just come out from the sky and smite us. That's just not how it works. So when we do things that we shouldn't be doing, we don't necessarily see the negative consequences immediately. Okay. As we said last week, this word pitgam, I actually looked it up. Last week I said I think it only shows up one other place in the whole Tanakh. I was incorrect. There's 8 places where it shows up in Tanakh. Each one of them is referring to the same exact thing. It's always a decree from the king. Okay. In the book of Esther, for example, the word pitgam is used to refer to the decree that Achashverosh, the wicked king of the Purim story, the decree that he puts out saying that all wives must listen to their husbands, regardless of how foolish or inconsistent their husbands are. The wives must listen to them. So the verse in Esther refers to that as pitgam hamelech, right? The decree of the king. The other places are basically all entirely from the book of Ezra, also referring to decrees of the Persian kings in regards to the Jews rebuilding the Second Temple. Okay, so again, pitgam would be a decree from a king, specifically. It's interesting that it's put over here. It almost ties this justice system back to a source, but it never mentions the source's name. So that leaves a little bit of a room for interpretation. Obviously, if we were to look at this from a religious perspective, Kohelet is referring to God. And that's actually going to show up a little bit more obvious in the coming verses, that he's going to make references to God, which again, he doesn't do that often in the book. We've discussed that before. But what we have over here is, right, if we want to say that this verse was talking about God, then that would be just one thing. Otherwise, it would be, just the nature of bad actions is not necessarily to get an immediate response, to get an immediate consequence. So that's just the nature of things. And because that's the nature of things, that's what leads people to do wicked actions, to do things that they should not be doing, because they do not see the consequence of those actions. All right, so that's great if we want to just say that this is a standalone, it's like in the middle of the book, he just decided to give us a nice little ethics lesson, or food for thought. Why is it people do bad things? Because they don't realize the negative effects. And by the way, I would point out that that's perhaps something that's worth discussing. Is that 100% true? I would be interested in testing that theory. Often people do bad things because they think it's the right thing to do. So that would go in the face of this. That would not necessarily work together with this verse. That's why I would say that this is one reason why people do bad things. But another way we could look at this is now back into the context of the verses surrounding it. So we're talking about this power vacuum. And we're talking about the people coming to fill that void that was created by the last leader disappearing, right? For whatever reason, that last leader is gone. The way he put it was they were buried, right? Risha'im kivurim, he said, buried wicked people. So people they don't necessarily make that connection between the burial of the wicked person and the actions that they did. They don't necessarily see anything about what that person did that would appear to be consequence. And that's what leads these people, these opportunists, is kind of what I was thinking of them. These are opportunists that come out of nowhere. As soon as there's a power vacuum, they come to fill the void. These opportunists, they get up and they run for it because they don't necessarily see the immediate effects of the reaction to the evil actions. In a certain way, it kind of it's kind of reminiscent of people who are looking to become famous. We see this time and time again. People who become famous for some reason, and their lives don't go in a pleasant direction for one reason or another. Occasionally it does, but very often at some point in the end of the story, it's not a great outcome for a famous person. And for some reason, so many of us still wake up or at some point in our lives and say, I really want to do that thing that's going to make me famous. What's going to make me an overnight sensation? Especially now when literally a person can become an overnight sensation with the technology we have nowadays, right? So for some reason, people still are gunning for those roles. They're still trying to get that nugget of fame, those 15 minutes of fame, as Andy Warhol would say, not realizing or even realizing that there's a consequence to that, but it doesn't seem to disturb anybody. They still want it. We still want it. Human beings, it's a natural desire that we have. It's because even though logically we may know that there is a pitgam for the Maaseh Hara, we understand that there is a decree following the wicked actions, but we don't necessarily, even though logically we know it's there, we don't see it. It doesn't fill our hearts. It doesn't fill our hearts the same way that Ra does, that the evil action does. So there's something to be said about that. If it was a direct cause effect, you could see it happening right in front of your eyes, that would probably change our relationship with a lot of different traits, a lot of different goals that people have, right? If we saw immediately the effects of wealth, then perhaps we would be, not so quick to jump to wealth, to fame, to all those sorts of things. And power would be another one of those things. Another interesting point is that he throws in this word bahem. He says, therefore, their hearts of people are filled inside of them to do wicked. He could have easily just said, Al-Kain Malay Leiv B'nei Hadam Lasot Ra. The hearts of mankind are filled to do evil. But he threw in that word bahem, inside of them. And I think it speaks to something that happens in the internal parts of the person also. We have this, again, if our parable is the person who comes with good intentions. He says, the person says, I'm going to take power, and I have the plan to save the country, to save the world, but that disappears very quickly. And so what happens when those things disappear? Inside the person, you also find a void that shows up. And that void will also need filling. And that filling is done here, lasot ra, to do wicked. So that bahem is a small word and a small difference, but it's a very interesting kind of connection back to the last verse. There's a void created not only in power, but there's a void created inside the person who latches on to power, who gets trapped by power, and that needs to be filled. And what does it get filled with? The cream filling becomes wickedness, becomes the desire or the need to do evil. Okay, as it is, as I've spoken about many times throughout the book so far, I'm hesitant to ever label what evil is, and it seems that he is also. He's just kind of putting it out there, so we can understand that as whatever we understand evil to be. Whether it's, again, from a religious perspective, we understand that there's things that God does not want us to do that would be evil. Whether it's socially or economically or in any other way, whatever we would perceive to be evil, you can interpret the verses in those ways. Again, as we see in the coming verses, he's going to bring the focus back to God, which again is not really what he often does in the book, but you will see that he does do that in the coming verses. So again, this verse 11, that was last week's verse. It could be a standalone lesson, but it could also, it fits very well in the context of the verses that we're in. Okay, and now we're going to see the devolvement of the person who takes power. Actually, no. Before we see that, we're going to first see more about this idea of not seeing the consequences to our actions or to wicked actions. So that brings us to verse number 12. Okay, another verse starting with the word asher. So this word asher comes up quite a few times over here. It's very similar to the word ki. It's linking back to the word the previous verse, and it's saying in addition to or to build upon the last idea. And the word itself actually means that, right? That, asher. Okay, so insofar as, right, is you could another way to translate it over here. Asher chote oseh ra. When we see right? When that it is that a sinner does wickedness, ma'at, which we'll discuss in a second what ma'at means, uma'arich lo, and they're given an extension. Time is lengthened for them. Ki, however, gam yudeani, I know, asher yetov lirei Elokim, that there will be good for those who fear God. Asher yirum ilfanav, for those who fear before Him. Okay, and as I mentioned, I don't know if you were able to hear this before, but I tend to use the gender he for Hashem, even though Hashem has no gender. That's a very important thing to know. God has no gender. God is not limited by gender. So what we have over here is this verse telling us two different things. There seems to be a break. I would say there's a break right over here between the word lo and the word ki. Okay, and if I were to read this verse properly, I think I would say that the first 7 words over here really belong to the last idea. Okay, the last thing is, you see, we don't see the consequences of our actions as they happen. We do things that are not correct, and we don't see the effects right away. And so what we have over here is he's enunciating that a little bit more, and he's saying, you see a sinner who does wicked, ma'at, umarich lo, and still they get an extension. Their time is extended, nothing happens to them. Okay, let's just discuss what this word ma'at means. It literally means 100-fold. Okay, there are two understandings in the commentaries of what the 100-fold is. Whether it is, according to Rashi, who's kind of like the king of the commentaries, he says it's 100 times wickedness. All right, you're doing super wicked things. Okay, the way the Mitsudah is learning it is that it's Ma'at, it's wickedness to 100 people. Okay, meaning 100 people or even 1,000 people. It's just a large number. So the way Rashi would look at this verse is that the actions themselves are wicked actions, very, very wicked actions, enormously wicked actions. Whereas the way the Mitsudah is looking at it is they are actions that are wicked that go and affect multiple people. They affect people that you are in control of, that in charge of. That kind of brings it back to the discussion of power a little bit, which makes a lot of sense, actually. If we say that it's wickedness to people, to the multitudes of people, then it makes sense that we would that fits into our discussion of power. Either way, so the first half of this verse is saying that you see that there's people who sin and do wicked things, perhaps very extreme wicked things, or perhaps wickedness that affects multiple people, and still, nevertheless, they have this arichut. They are given this extension. Okay. So what do I do as the wise person? This is what King Solomon would say. As a wise person, what do I do to address this issue? We don't see the effects of the wickedness. It doesn't show, no lightning bolts coming down from heaven. And not only that, you could see people whose actions make waves. They make shock waves towards other people, or they're just extremely bad actions. And nevertheless, they get this seeming extension from the universe, from God, whatever you want to call it. Okay, so he addresses this question almost in a twofold manner. So part number one is this part over here. Key, because Gam Yudeani, I know, Asher Yeh Tov Lirei Elokim, that there will be good for those who fear God. But then he adds in one more thing, okay? There will be good for those who fear God. Great. But then he says, Asher Yiru'u Milefanav, for those who fear before him. Where else would they fear? Like, what else would that be? What's the repetition of that idea? Not just those who fear God, but those who fear before God. Okay? I don't necessarily know what that means. I have to understand what that means. And this reminds me personally of an idea I saw brought down in a book many years ago. But I think it's an important lesson anyway, an important idea anyway, is that we seem to think we know who's righteous and who's wicked, right? In our limited judgment, we're able to look at people and we say, that guy's a good guy, that guy's a bad guy, right? And that's honestly a very limited view of people. And we have a very limited view of people, and we think we know what people go through and what they struggle with, but nevertheless, we really don't know what it is that people are dealing with. And that changes a lot of what we're going to perceive as a righteous person or a wicked person. You can have a person who on the outside seems to be a righteous person, but you don't know what things that they're doing under the surface. And that's really what he's talking about over here in this first verse. In this verse over here, is he's saying that goodness will come to those who fear God, but not the people that you think fear God. Those who fear before Him, meaning before Him out of our sight. Milfanav, the idea of milifnim, which is the other version of this word. If you were to take out the possessive, milfanav, in front of Him, if it was just milifnim, would mean not just in front of, but within. We talk about in the temple, for example, the high priest would go into the Holy of Holies, lifnai v'lifnim, right, on Yom Kippur, right? So he'd go into the very inner part of the temple. So milifnim also means kind of within the boundaries, within the scope of God. So if we were to look and say, why is it that I don't see good stuff happening to the good people? So one of the responses to that would be, you don't know what's a good person, right? We don't have a great sense of what it is that a good person is. Perhaps a good person is, okay, a obvious example is maybe this person's not a good person. Now, okay, that's also hard to say. We have some people who it would be very difficult, very, very distant idea to say that they're not good people. But perhaps we also can understand that they need something from the things that they're going through that are not that we're not privy to. The basic idea being that there's information that we're missing. So when we are looking to see, oh, I want to see the good stuff happening to the good people, that will make sense to me. That will set me on the right path. Well, you're not going to see that. You know it. I know it again logically, but you're not going to see it because that all happens milefanav in the small, I would say the private calculations of God, right? Looking from a godly perspective, from a religious perspective. Okay, I don't really have an understanding of how these verses would be looked through any other perspective necessarily. But when we talk about why don't I see that good thing happening to good people? Well, you don't know what's there. There's nuances to the justice system that we're not privy to. So we can't necessarily just look and say, oh, good person, good thing, got it. I should be a good person. That's not going to be a good way for us to view the world, because we don't have that information. We don't have enough information to make those judgments, to base those judgments on. Okay, he's going to give us the converse in the next verse. So you know what? Let's get to the next verse, because the two verses are connected. Okay, as you can actually see by the vav at the beginning of the word of the first word. So verse number 13, it says like this: "V'tov, and goodness, lo yihyeh l'rasha, will not come to the wicked person." So whereas goodness came, I know that goodness will come to the good person. I know also that goodness will not come to the wicked person. This is kind of part 2 of the argument. V'lo ya'arich yamim, and there will not be an extension of days. Katzel, rather it will be like a shade, like literally a shadow. Asher inenu yarei milifnei Elokim, for those who do not fear before God. Okay, so again, let's read the verse one more time all together. V'tov lo yihyeh l'rasha, goodness will not come to the wicked person. V'lo ya'arich yamim, and there will not be an extension of days. Katzel, just like a shadow that passes by. Asher inenu yarei milifnei Elokim, for the one who does not fear before God. Okay, so this is kind of part number 2, is now extend the same logic we had to the last verse, and we say, look, we had a good person, but they're only good in the eyes of God. He knows that they're good people. I wouldn't necessarily have come to that conclusion, but goodness is happening to that person. And the same thing is true. You're not going to get that reaction to a bad person. A truly bad person is not going to get goodness. A truly bad person, someone who's not Yarei milifnei Elokim, who's not fearful before God, will not get this extension of time. Okay? So what we have over here are really two sides of the same coin, but there is a lack of information that we have that we cannot pass judgment on why people should or should not deserve good things or bad things, because we lack too much information. That's kind of the surface level of this verse over here. I would say you can't read these verses without seeing that explanation. Okay? There's good people, there's bad people, there is good to the good people, there is bad to the bad people. That works out. You just have to follow. If you knew the inside scoop, then you would get the full story. Okay, so again, that would be the what I would consider the almost simple rendering of verse number 12 and verse number 13. But I think there's another idea over here. You know what? I'm going to, I hope this works out for everyone. I'm going to make this a little smaller so that we can maybe see both of the verses together. Oh, I lost my place over here. That happens when I make it smaller. Okay. Please forgive me if I make this just a little smaller. We can get both verses on the same page. Okay. Okay. There we go. So here we have the two verses together. If you look at these two verses together, again, I hope you can see it. It says like this: there's a sinner who does bad things, a lot of bad things, or very intense bad things, and they get an extension. Says, nah, well, good things happen to good people. Okay. And he says, good things don't happen to bad people. And there will not be an extension for those who do not fear God. Okay, well, just a second there. We just said two very different things. In verse number 12, he made an observation, right? The powerful make the observation. The opportunists looking for power make an observation, and they're not wrong. It says that the sinner who does bad things, and again, we've qualified that as bad things. Those are pretty intense bad things. And nevertheless, they do get this extension, whatever this extension is, extension of time, extension of resources, extension, whatever that extension is. Nevertheless, we do find that there is an extension given. But then logically, he shows up and says, no, it doesn't happen, right? There's good for the good, there's bad for the bad, okay? Well, how are those true? How do we reconcile the fact that there's an observation, what's the word I'm looking for? It doesn't matter. Okay, right? We have an observation that there's an empirical observation. Sorry, that's the word I was looking for. You have an empirical observation that there is an extension granted to the sinners, and then we have the fact that he's telling us on a lesson level that it's not true. There's no extension. He quite literally says, "V'lo yarich yamim." There will not be an extension. Katzel, they are like shadow. Who is Asher Einenu Yoreh Milifnei Elokim? The one who does not fear before God. So those seem to be contradictory things. And it's almost like if you went to the rabbi and said, "Rabbi, I'm really going through something difficult right now." The rabbi said, "No, you're not. No, you're not. You know, what you're going to a doctor, you say, "I have a headache." No, you don't have a headache. Like, what would that's a very strange thing to happen. So it doesn't seem logical what King Solomon is doing over here. But then if you look at the verses a little more carefully, you'll notice that there's actually three different things mentioned over here. Okay. Number one is in verse number 12, we have the word choteh. We have the word choteh. Choteh means somebody who sins. Okay. Somebody who sins and does wicked. It actually does a lot of wicked, does some severe wicked. But this person was never labeled as a sinner. This person was simply a person who sinned. Okay, sinned and did wicked things. Again, extremely wicked things. But nevertheless, it never calls them a wicked person. Then you have over here in verse number 13, you've got the Rasha, the actual wicked person, that person is titled, sealed, signed, sealed, delivered. This is a wicked person. And that is no good. No good will come to that person. Okay. And then we've got a third category over here of Inenu Yarei Milifnei Elokim, the one who does not fear before God. So if you look at the verses carefully, we'll notice that there are, again, three different groups mentioned over here. On number one is the sinner, who's never labeled as a bad person, simply a person who sins. And again, pretty extreme sinning. Then on the other side, I would say on the other side of the spectrum, you've got the Rasha, the wicked person. Don't even need to talk about who that is. It's a wicked person. Let me see if I can. I can't really. Yeah, hopefully that'll be a little better. Okay, so we have, again, on one side we've got the sinner, the sinner on one side, somebody who does a sin, never labeled as a bad person, just simply a person who sins. On the other hand, you've got the other side of the spectrum, the Rasha, the wicked person. We don't even have to talk about what a Rasha is. Okay, he doesn't tell us anything about that person. Then you've got a third category, and almost, I don't know if it's a middle category, but it's another category, and that's someone who is asher enenu yarei milifnei elokim, someone who does not fear before God. So these are three different things, and they have three different reactions to them. Okay, the one who's a sinner, the one who's simply a sinner, that person, again, empirical evidence shows us that they have an extension to their time. That would mean what I perceive over here is you've got a person who's a really essentially an okay person. I'm not going to say necessarily a good person. We have a person who's an okay person, but they make mistakes. They don't just make mistakes, they make big mistakes. They don't just make big mistakes, they make mistakes that affect other people. But nevertheless, there is, in the big justice system, there's an extension placed on that, given to that person. Okay? That person is what most of us see. When we see the wicked, or somebody that we would perceive as a wicked person, when we see that going on, we see them in that role, in that period of time, kind of their extension time. Okay, that's where we perceive people. That's where we see those people. And that's where mistakes are made. That's where when we see that person, we say, oh, they're living the life of Riley. It's not so bad for them. Well, that's because they're currently in a state of extension. They have a time extension to their to what's going on. Then on the other side of the spectrum, we do have the Rasha, the wicked person, the truly wicked person, and no good will come to that person. Now, that's, again, it's a hard thing to say, to see. We have some people that I think we'd all agree are the wickedest of the wicked, and maybe we do see them with some good, but you would take some good looking to see a deep dive into their realities to determine whether or not their lives are actually good. I'm going to hold off from really placing it that much focus on that part of the verse right now. But then there's this third piece over here, which is the one who does not fear before God. Well, that's a very interesting person, because that could actually just be a good person. That could just be a totally good person. Somebody who's doing the right thing, but doesn't fear God, who doesn't have that fear of some bigger story besides for themselves. So whereas you have the sinner who's actually doing the wrong thing, they're granted an extension. You get to watch them as they are placed in a position to make a choice whether or not to fix themselves up or not. But then you've got a very different person over here, is the one who does not fear God. And that person does not get the extension. Lo yarich yamim, there is no extension of days. Katzel, rather, it's like shadow. Asher enenu yarei milifnei elokim, for the one who does not fear God. So that's a very interesting statement over there.
It's almost,
sorry.
Yeah, so this almost seems to parallel 3 of the 4 sons in Haggadah.
Let me think about that for a second. Yeah, I think you may be right about that. In fact, you would have
I don't
all
know if
four
it's an
sons if you think
I
about
don't
it.
know if it's an exact parallel, but I think there is a correlation.
Yeah, because you also have the Tov. The second half of verse 12 over here had Tov. Goodness happens to those who fear God. So I think there's very, very, very likely to be you can make an argument that there would be a connection there. I think you're right there. Yeah, that's very interesting. Hmm. Okay. Yeah. Wow. That actually opened up a lot of doors right over here. Uh, Sorry, I'm just checking the chat over here for a second. That's a very good question. Diane is asking, where in Kohelet do we meet the person who gives every indication of fearing God, but who suffers more than others? That's also a very good question. I would have to look into that to give a proper answer for that. Good question. Let me finish the thought over here. King Solomon also, in his other book, in his Mishlei, in his Proverbs, I'm about to say parables, and in Proverbs, he tells us another idea, a very similar idea. He says that the way of life is always upwards for the wise person, for the thinking person. And that's a very common lesson that we have in the Torah, is that in order for a person to be on a good path, in order for a person to do well in their lives, they always have to be moving upwards. It's almost like life is a downwards escalator. And so if you try to stand exactly where you want to be, exactly straight, you want to stay exactly where you are, you're much more likely to dip down. Look at people who are trying to lose weight, right? So when they're on a diet, they lose weight. When they're on maintenance, they say, okay, I'm at the weight I want. Now I just want to keep it there. So they start relaxing, and next thing you know, they're buying the bigger pants again, right? So in the same way, in our own lives, we find that we have to constantly kind of be on this path of some sort of growth. The one who does not fear before God, in my understanding, would be the person who does things right, but it's going there. There's no meaning behind it. They have none of this yirat elokim, this fear of God. Fear of God, I've mentioned before in previous classes, that itself is a hard idea to really comprehend. I'm afraid to get into that myself, what exactly fear of God is. But let's say fear of God means becoming a better person. So they're not becoming a better person. They're happy with where they are. If you're happy with where you are and you're not working to become better, you actually are in almost a worse spot than somebody who's doing bad things. It doesn't mean you should do bad things. But somebody who's doing bad things is given an extension because they're always, at any point, they can hit a point where they say, I want to do better now. But what happens when you're happy with where you are? Well, you can't stay in that for a long period of time. That zone does not last. So whether he wants to say this is a karma idea, that you're not given the time, or whether he's just saying that you can't stay there. Lo yarich yamim katzel, right? That period of time where you're just happy with where you are, that's always a period like a shadow that passes by very quickly. It's almost intangible. It doesn't last. And so he's saying almost naturally it occurs that lo yarich yamim, that state does not last forever. So bringing it all home is when you see that there's people who are doing the wrong thing, but they seem to still be given resources and opportunity and time and everything like that. That's because they're being given an extension. Hopefully they'll see what they need to see to rectify themselves, okay? And they'll never reach that state of a rasha, of a truly wicked person, labeled, stamped, wicked person, okay? But then there's a third category of person who is in this kind of limbo state. They're happy with where they are, but they don't let fear of God or desire to grow or anything guide their lives. That does not last forever. A wise person sees that and realizes that definitely does not last forever. And that's going to help you in determining when, again, wisdom versus power, that dynamic, you're going to be able to determine a little better where to apply wisdom as opposed to power. This whole thing has been a discussion of time. So again, that time is one of those limits on power. So extensions of time, well, that's part of what you're seeing. When you see that, when the wise person sees the powerful person in their power at this moment, realize that that itself is an extension granted to that person, not necessarily the reality. It's just a holding pattern that they're in. Okay, that's it for this week. A little overtime, so let's go back into the main session over here. Okay, thank you for joining us. God willing, I believe next week we should be on. I don't see any problem right now as to